remainder of the hour as a designee of the minority leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. May I inquire to time remaining?
The gentleman has 27 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. And Congressman Gomer, thank you. I appreciate it. It's the joy of this week's schedule and then trying to get our floor time. Look, I try to come behind the mic at least every week when we're here. And the last few times, I've been rather cranky. I'm intensely frustrated on policies of the majority. You know, the majority, the Democrats, the left have controlled this place now for what, 15 months. Poor people are poor, working poor are poor, middle class is poor, and there's just this frustration for people like myself on we got to stop it, stop hurting people. And a couple of the responses to the YouTube video that went out on one of the previous floor speeches was, okay, just give us something optimistic. So let's try to do something optimistic today. But understand, this optimism requires this body to think differently, particularly my brothers and sisters in the majority. On occasion, you're going to have to back away from who writes checks, and start to think about what would the future look like if we would just even fixate, focus, consider, listen to some of these ideas. First one, and I've been to the floor multiple times on this, and I'm not going to even start with the debt chart, which used to be a tradition, but I would often stand here with this chart saying, hey, you do realize in the next 29 years, we're functionally heading to, what is it, like $112, $115 trillion of borrowed money in today's dollars. And the thing we are terrified to tell the American people is 75% of that is functionally Medicare. The other 25% is the shortfall in Social Security. It's demographics. But when you break it apart, that $80+ trillion of borrowing that's in today's dollars, that is the shortfall in Medicare, 31% of that is just diabetes. 33% of all healthcare spending in the United States is diabetes. If you wanted to lower the cost of healthcare, if you wanted to make healthcare more available and accessible, you got to stop doing what this place has been doing for a couple decades now, where we play the game on who pays and who gets subsidized. Obamacare, the ACA, was about who gets subsidized and who had to pay. The Republican alternative had some of the same sin, and heaven knows Medicare for All is purely a financing scam. It isn't about what we pay. So let's actually do some things that are hopeful. We've been tracking the theory behind this for a couple years now. And it's functionally replacing insulin-producing cells. I did a whole presentation on how they take stem cells and convert them and tap them with a CRISPR so your body doesn't want to reject them. But the fact of the matter is we've now had a couple people who've been cured of type 1 diabetes. Now, it's a proof of concept study. They've begun phase 1. Right now, the FDA has them on a pause as they're working out dosing. But the fact of the matter is we're that close conceptually to a cure for type 1. And the fact of the matter is the premise works for type 2, but you got to deal with some of the ancillaries, which are really uncomfortable conversation. I represent, we believe, the population with the second highest diabetic population in the world, one of my tribal communities. Mr. Speaker, and many of the others here, we may have urban populations that have diabetic populations, are rural poor. The fact of the matter is, wouldn't it be amazing if Republicans and Democrats in this place were fixating on this concept of, we're going to fixate on curing the misery. We're not going to go out and build a bunch more clinics and say we care, so live with your misery. The concept that there's a chance that if we put our resources in the right place, just like Operation Warp Speed did, remember how many people here said, you can't do that in a year, but they did it. And then we could actually have the more difficult debate here of, if this is cure for type 1, how do you move into type 2? What do you do for lifestyle, health, what we eat? And there's some data out there we've been working on that shows one of the key contributors to income inequality in our society is the fact that family members are suffering, they're having their toes cut off. It's health. So we hear speech after speech after speech after speech here about income inequality, the working, the poor, da, 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 da. But how about embracing technology and taking a run at it? And yeah, there's a chance it doesn't work. But we're talking trillions and trillions of spending in our near future just on diabetes. Isn't it worth investing in ending the misery? And there's hope. But that's actually something that would be honorable and noble and compassionate and moral. But it doesn't fit the playbook here because that isn't the people showing up here writing you a check. And a point of reference we got to get through our heads. 5% of our brothers and sisters who have chronic conditions, often multiple chronic conditions, are the majority of healthcare spending. So if 5% is functionally 50% of all the spending, what happens if you help cure some of those chronic conditions? You want to have an impact on the cost of healthcare. Stop thinking of it as a financing problem. Think of it as a cures issue. And I will argue this is optimistic. It's hopeful. We're in a time of technology miracles. And when was the last time you had anyone, particularly from the majority, talk about something that was optimistic, that could make the poor less poor, make society healthier, and provide opportunity that didn't also require government running our lives? In many ways, this does just the opposite. It sets us free. And this isn't pie in the sky. Some of this is happening around us. I mean, this week, I should have brought the picture, but FDA approved a home COVID test that does more than COVID. It actually also does detects flu and RSV, and it's a home test, and it's been approved. So this isn't utopian. It exists. The other thing, it becomes a more difficult conversation is, if we care about people, we care about freedom, we care about crashing the price of healthcare, why not legalize technology? So I just sort of show this as just, in some ways, it's as much about the picture to get the concept. Let me tell the story first. A few years ago, I'm reading some of the crazy blogs and research stuff that, I sit on an airplane 10 hours a week. And there's this story about this material science professor who has built this thing that you blow into and instantly, well, pretty instantly, tells you have a virus. Can figure out sort of the category of the virus, and then turns around and can ping off your medical records on your phone, and theoretically could actually order your antivirals. And the newer generations are doing much more than just the category of virus. They're picking up bacteria. There's even one out there that the researchers say we can pick up a number of dead cancer proteins, because when a cancer cell dies, it throws off that dead DNA strip. It's functionally a flu kazoo. I thought you'd like that name. What's the problem with that technology? In this place, it's illegal. You'd have an algorithm writing a prescription. You'd have a pharmacist filling a prescription. The Social Security Act says you will see a doctor, not an algorithm, not something you can have in your home medicine cabinet that you can blow into. But do we actually care about people? Or do we care about the people lining up at our offices who want to slow down the technology? Think of the lobbying that goes on in this place to stop telehealth. The fact of the matter is, I've done telehealth here for a dozen years. And the number of times my office was full of people say, we really like the technology, but we need to slow it down. We don't think you have enough cost controls. They would do anything because it changed the economics of delivering healthcare. Pandemic hit. To the majority's credit, a piece of legislation I'd worked on for years, they grabbed that language, plugged it in. That's our telehealth expansion we have today. You do realize it goes away. The expansion on telehealth goes away when the pandemic's declared over. And there's people lobbying on Capitol Hill to make sure that happens. So we talk about how much we care, but the fact of the matter is opportunities, technologies, the ability to use this to stay healthy. If it's not making certain people money, they're here on this campus trying to lobby against it. And you start to realize this isn't utopian. The technology exists. When you have a breath biopsy that you can blow into that instantly can tell you if you have COVID. Why doesn't this place look forward? Because so much of the policy we have debated here, it's as if we're talking about the 1990s. And the fact of the matter is there's investment all coming in. This is another breath biopsy, the things you can wear that someone like myself, I have hypertension. You wear the thing on your wrist and helps you manage it. And Mr. Speaker, one of the simplest things, and it's not even a thought experiment. 16% of all U.S. healthcare spending is functionally related to people not taking their medicines. So if you have hypertension, do you take your hypertension medicine? You have high cholesterol, do you take your statins? The things that keep you from having a stroke. A pill bottle lid that just beeps at you when you forgot to take your medicine in the morning, or the thing that drops the pills for grandma to stay healthy. The model says it's 550 million, actually it's 550 billion. 550, so 16% of healthcare spending, $550 billion a year. It's $500 billion a year, more than $500 billion a year. If you just use something as simple as a pill bottle lid that reminded you needed to take your healthcare, your medicines. Now, I know that's a little utopian, and it wouldn't be the complete adoption, but it's the concept. There are solutions around here that exist. We're just incapable of discussing them because they don't fit sort of the blinded, narrow vision, because we had our talking points from our political campaigns a decade ago, and we haven't read a damn article since then. And so my fixation also on telehealth is how about people in areas that don't, my Navajo Nation that doesn't have Wi-Fi? Well, the fact of the matter is you're seeing it in Ukraine right now, aren't you? When you have satellite broadband that's available to functionally every place in North America right now, wouldn't it be moral, cheaper, more efficient, and actually forward-looking, saying, hey, maybe the solution for the family is in the middle of rural America, give them the plate-shaped satellite dish, and boom, they have Wi-Fi. They have broadband. It makes them available to use telehealth. Would that be something? Or instead, we're going to subsidize billions and billions and billions of dollars to maybe run a strip of fiber out there, which we've been doing for decades. It's time we actually sort of enter this century. And then there's other things that just drive me nuts. So how much discussion have you had from the White House, from the Democrat leadership here about supply chains? Much of inflation isn't their fault. It's not their spending. It's not their regulatory process. It's not the changing the capital stack, restricting access to hydrocarbons. It's not their fault. It's not their policies. It's shipping. But then they do brilliant things like this, where they actually have in their Build Back Better legislation, they slipped a sentence in there saying you don't get to automate the ports. So think about how insane this is. The giveaway to the Longshoremen Union was so important to the Democrats that they'll give speeches about how we need to fix the supply chain, we need to get the goods moving, but we're going to make sure that you can't do it through automation. It's in their legislation. Do we have a vision of what the future can be, where it's more productive, more prosperous, more hopeful, more opportunity for everyone? Or does our majority here of Democrats continue to slip little things like in this that basically calcify the misery that's in our communities right now? And why this slide is important is if we're forward-looking. You know, I just came across this, and it's the thought experiment. So a couple of SpaceX engineers have a company, and they're working apparently with the rail community of, and I know this picture isn't great, it's little autonomous electric platforms, so you'd pull a container off and put it right on the platform, and that container drives to where it's supposed to go. It's a little spur crossing. It's going to Arizona storage if it's leaving the Port of Long Beach, but through the port of, you know, that Alameda corridor that's all backed up for those of us who lean more towards the west. But it's a technology solution. And instead of this place holding hearings of saying, what are the regulatory barriers? What are the labor regulatory barriers? There's an optimistic solution. This place will run away from it because if one of the union groups doesn't like it, it becomes a power and money, not what's actually good for the American people. But there are solutions like this of autonomous rail cars. And they're run by batteries. This one's been out for a few years, and they're working on it. It's actually making amazing progress. And you're hearing the discussions right now of food insecurity around the world. I believe it's mostly University of Illinois has been doing this amazing work on how to get plant productivity dramatically better. And I've done whole presentations here on the floor about C4 plants, C3 plants, and how you tweak them. You remember God made the plants, so sometimes they grab an oxygen molecule. They really wanted the carbon molecule. And I apologize for the folks trying to take this down. Wave at me if I'm talking too fast. I had a lot of coffee, which is a typical day. But the optimism of what would this mean to feeding the world? What would this mean to inflation? What would this mean just for the morality of there being the efficiency of you need less food or fuel, water, fertilizer, if the technology is real? And the early reports, it's pretty darn impressive. So we're holding hearings on this, right? We're having discussions of how this would be amazing to help the world grow more food and protect the environment. Of course not, because there's no one showing up with a check to talk about this. And the next one I'm going to show you is just my fixation. You do realize in the last functionally decade, the United States has removed so much baseload nuclear power that it's functionally equaled every bit of renewable that's hit the grid. So on one hand, we have this optimism. Think about all the photovoltaic and wind. Isn't this exciting? Oh, by the way, we removed so much baseload nuclear power. We haven't gone anywhere. And I know there's a huge cadre of my colleagues here that despises nuclear power. So when you have a Nobel Prize physicist saying, hey, we think there's actually a way you could use a high pulse laser to break nuclear materials down. When you actually have other people reporting that saying we actually need to be taking the spent nuclear and refining it because our nuclear stocks have crashed. There's a long history of that. Post-Cold War, lots of the weapons grade, we've been knocking it down to use in other uses, and now that stockpile's running out. But why wouldn't you invite this physicist here to Capitol Hill and say, what would it take investment-wise, time-wise, to have a way to break down nuclear waste? You remember, he's the guy with the Nobel Prize. This place isn't. This is optimism. This is hope. And then you have other things. You know, I remember talking about this technology as a kid, of how you could build batteries. We used to refer to them as a rust battery, where it's a closed loop. They're very heavy. They only work in functional utility grade. You couldn't have them in your car. But they don't use rare earths. Why aren't these people here on Capitol Hill talking to us about how we could fix our power storage situation, particularly for those of us in the West where during the afternoon we have all this photovoltaic come in, but then the sun goes down and we're still running our air conditioning and we have this crash. there's hope, there's opportunities. Do all these work? I don't know. But that's what this body is supposed to be about, is what does the future look like? Instead, we're litigating ideas that are 20 years out of date. This one actually is out there right now in, I guess, near Houston, where they actually have a gas-fired power plant. I believe it's called the Allen cycle, and it has no smokestacks. They basically use the throw-off to spin. So you burn, you spin. Instead of boiling water and having the steam spin it, it's the burn that spins the turbines, and then they capture all the CO2 and functionally save it and use it for other sources. There's no smokestack. This is up and running today. And yes, it's had some engineering problems, but the concept, why don't we talk about this? If you say you care about greenhouse gases and we care about the fact that much of America may have brownouts, blackouts, power-wise in the United States this year, there's a way that technology is the solution. And this last one I'm going to do just because it is the quintessential that sometimes there is a solution, but no one's figured out really how to make a bunch of money on it, so no one here is going to ever talk about it. A number of my brothers and sisters on the left despise natural gas. I'm fascinated with it because you do realize a couple of years ago, the expansion of fracking and natural gas got us within a couple hairs of actually the Paris Accords, without us even being part of the Paris Accord agreement. And it was because of natural gas. And my brothers and sisters on the left who despise natural gas, well, it's the excuse of, well, there's methane. There's methane leakage. And methane is like 9 to 1 in the global warming calcs, even though its half-life is disputed a bit. Okay, so if we had a way to deal with the methane bleed, would my Democrat colleagues functionally let Wall Street, let pension plans, everyone else finally go back to investing in natural gas? Well, there's a number of research out there that said, hey, did you know that if you can take kitty litter, clay, I think they tag it with some copper oxide, it becomes a methane sponge. And it's really, really cheap. It's functionally clay. Why wouldn't we have a hearing about this and have a discussion saying, you're saying we could be going back to extracting lots of natural gas because the price is off the charts? And why this is so important is, do not let someone lie to you and say, well, the reason your gas prices, the reason the natural gas prices are so high is, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The futures market last September, October was telling us that fuel prices were about to go off the charts. It had already begun. It was substantially because of the cancellations of pipelines, the permits, and the capital stack, the threat that the Securities and Exchange Commission was going to require all sorts of disclosures. The fact of the matter is, this majority became very hostile to hydrocarbons. It was already coming. The Russian invasion just made some of these prices that you're going to suffer through this summer happen earlier. And part of the excuse is, well, natural gas, yes, it's half the environmental load of maybe coal, but they still hate it, because of that methane. Okay. How about if I came to you and said, it doesn't cure all the problem, but it would cure part of it. There's a solution. So, Mr. Speaker, my last comment. This place has been miserable for the last 15 months. It's been dour, it's been angry, it's been sad. Wouldn't it be interesting if somewhere in here our colleagues on the left and the right just held a few hearings and said, what does the future look like for technology disruption that's good for poor people, it's good for the working poor, it's good for the middle class? Instead of sort of this march towards screw them, let them suffer, because our ideology is more important than what's really going on, because both parties here deserve to be judged by not our words, not our virtue signaling, but what we actually accomplished. Take a look at what we did when we had the full majority. Go take a look at the economy in 2018, 19, first quarter of 2020, because we fully intend to judge you for what you did this 2 years. And the fact of the matter is, income inequality, food insecurity, the poor, the middle class, all had a hell of a lot better economy, a better life during our years than yours. And with that, Madam Speaker,